we return to our discussion on Wu Mingyi's Man with the Compound Eyes. So we're going to look at parts 7 to 11. Yeah. Okay, so part 7, the chapters are story of Atlay's Island, the story of Alice's Island, the story of Dahu's Island, the story of Hafei's Island. So we're given an insight into their idea of the island. So even in the case of, say, Alice, Dahu, and Hafei, though they come from Taiwan and they belong to the same island, their perspective of the island differs because they don't come from the same community, which means their identity and their perspective itself varies. Now, this is also the part where Alice and Atley meet and interact and start to communicate with each other. So one of the major things about this particular part is language and communication, trying to sort of decipher each other's language and sort of make sense of what the other is saying, as well as communicating with the land, like learning the land, understanding the space that you belong to now. Like, for instance, Atley, the island that he ends up on is so unlike Waiwao, so he needs to understand the lay of the land. And yet, because he's so attuned to nature, he's able to actually grasp it faster than with Alice. And that's something we actually see in the successive chapters. Now, we also find out their history about their islands. So in the section where Atley talks about his island, he talks about how it came to be. The fact that theirs is a land where they were punished for living excessively. All right, they were punished for taking so much from the land, for populating and overtaking the entire space to a point where they were punished with a lot of storms and natural changes that affected their lives. And so then the rule came that the second sons had to sort of leave, because you must not have too many people on the land, and that's how you sort of protect the land from excess. All right. And one of the other things we also see in this section is how there's a removal of hierarchy itself. So we've been frequently told about the sea sage and the earth sage, but there's no guarantee that the children of the sea sage or the earth sage will become the next sage. But sageship has never been inherited. Since the beginning, it has been attained through initiation and instruction. So one of the things is that when you cut off hierarchy, you cut off the possibility of someone being like, oh, but that's my child, and so they deserve this over anybody else. It's more to do with, do they have ability? If they have ability, they'll get it. It's as simple as that. So that's a very interesting thing that we see. Now, we're also introduced to the word Gessi. Now, Gessi is actually defined in the section in page 198, where it said it's a place covered in incomprehensible things. All right, which actually is described in much more detail in an earlier section in page 40. Yeah, in page 40, where he talks about the trash vortex as a Gessi. The island sometimes looked like a giant floating cage, a shadowy incantation, a rootless place, the symmetry of all creation. Aside from a few species of seabird that made nests and laid eggs on the island from time to time, nothing else could survive there. Creatures that died from eating bits of the island eventually became part of the island. Atley thought he too might end up becoming part of the island, so this is what hell was like, he thought. So this is the land of death. Kind of on point, because the idea that if you're living on a plastic trash vortex, it's unlikely to contribute to your well-being. Now, there is, again, a lot of commentary on how nature is changing, and nature is changing so dramatically that you can't actually keep up with the changes. So, for instance, in the section on a story of Alice's Island, there comes this bit. The sea is totally changed. From a distance, it is still blue or even multi-hued on account of the garbage. But having spent time with the sea on a daily basis, I can feel its emotions. Now the scene seems to be made out of pain and misery. All right. And sort of ahead it goes on to say, you know, there's never mention of the fact that actually we contributed to the formation of the trash vortex. Considering the size of our island, we made a pretty big contribution. In the past, we avoided paying the inevitable price of development and let more impoverished regions bear the cost for us. But now it's payback time. The sea has sent the bill for the interest. So the idea that whatever action you engage with nature, nature will sort of give it back to you, and not as some kind of karmic act of violence or a karmic decision of, this is your wrong and this is what you have to be paid. It's just nature doing it without any malice or without any oh, you did this, you must be punished kind of a statement. It's not even so much as a conscious entity as this came from this direction, this shall return to you in this fashion. It's that kind of an energy that he seems to sort of convey in this. All right, and it's in fact the continuing narrative of the entire book, because you're constantly talking about the sickness of the sea, the sickness of the mountains, and that nothing you do is going to sort of change that, because it's become the inevitable nature of the entire space. Now, while we are also talking about how to communicate and understand the land, we are also being told how each one has understood the land differently. So there is an interesting bit where when Alice talks about the land, she talks about how she's a migrant, in the sense that, strictly speaking, people like me are latecomers to Taiwan. We crossed the sea to get here a couple hundred years ago, which means they are not native to this land. They have come from elsewhere. In that sense, it's kind of connects to Alison Russell's speech, Dream of America, where she also talks about the idea that if you do not belong to an indigenous community, you are a migrant. Okay, you don't belong to this land, or you don't come from this land, or you haven't stewarded this land for 10 plus, 1,000 years. So this is not your space in that sense. And to sort of also make sense of how Wu Ming is trying to sort of talk about nature, sort of understand his argument about nature. So even before, there has been a lot of discussion on the idea of, people anthropomorphizing nature and saying, oh, nature's violent, nature's this, nature's that. Actually, no, because when we see the interaction between Alice and Atlee, where Atlee teaches her that you have to always respond to the statement, which is, if the question is asked, is the weather fair at sea today? You must always reply, very fair. And so she asks him, even if it's raining as hard as it is now, you still have to reply that way? Yes. If you don't feel like replying, yes. So, and you must each ask yourself that question. Now, why is that such an interesting and important exchange? Is that nature is always fair. Okay, because nature is never violent. Nature is never destructive. Nature is being nature. That's the essential idea that Wu Ming brings up, and which I've been trying to sort of mention over and over again, is that there is nothing like nature being unfair to you. Nature is behaving as nature's want to do. Our interaction with nature is what's bringing out this response from us. So we're like, it's not being fair to me, or it's working against what I want. But if the sea, for instance, is calm, that's nature being nature. The sea is being rough, that's nature being nature. So nature is always fair. The sea is always fair. And that's a very important exchange. And it comes up multiple times. I think later on, even at page 320 or something, it comes up again, the idea of nature is fair. Even though it's drizzling, and even though it's horrible, and even though they've had a particularly frightening experience, nature is fair because nature is fair. Nature is nature. And that's interesting. Now, it is our interaction with nature that changes everything. And in fact, one of the ways that comes up over here is through the idea of colonialism. So colonialism is addressed in the book, all right, subtly, but it's definitely addressed. Like for instance, when Dahu talks about um, colonial impact on the Bunun people. Father said that, this is in his section, part 7 itself. Father said that during the colonial era, the Japanese kept forcing the Bunun to move around for fear we would unite against the authorities. They even forced us to cultivate rice just to prevent us from getting to know the mountains. Once we got used to paddy agriculture, the status of a hunter plummeted, and the Bunun people knew the mountains less and less. And mountains will not protect a person who does not know them. So how colonialism destroys livelihood and culture because of threat. And there are other ways it's mentioned. For instance, in page 41, the Earth Sage talks about the colonial interaction with Wayo. The white man may come and the white man may go, but we live by the way of Wayo. We don't need the white man. The gifts he left us are harmful, ill-gotten gains. There's just this useless watch, a couple of books, and a few children like Rasula. But there may come a day when the other men who live upon the earth cause Wayo to vanish. You never know. So the idea that your actions may affect somebody else's reality, it's an actual possibility in this world. The fact is that we cannot claim to live in isolation. Our life may seem so unlike other people, or we may seem so far away and far removed from other people, but it can continue to affect us. Any decision made out there. All right. And we are again introduced to the man with the compound eyes. So this is Dahu's experience. So Hafiz had an experience, Dahu has an experience. Okay. I discovered that his eyes weren't like human eyes. They were more like compound eyes, composed of countless single eyes. The eyes of clouds, mountains, streams, meadowlarks, and muntjacs, all arranged together. As I gazed, each little eye seemed to contain a different scene, and those scenes arranged to form a vast panorama, the likes of which I have never seen. All right, and it's the idea, and we've already been told from Hafiz's narrative that the man with the compound eyes is the figure of the ancestor, someone who's very knowledgeable and is able to tell us so much about the world around us. And so even for Dahu, this experience comes with this great learning, and he decides to take it in his stride. It may come across as a very strange thing for most people, but if you're culturally attuned to this kind of knowledge, maybe it doesn't come as too strange or frightening to someone to actually engage with this. Now, in part 8, we have the chapters Through the Mountains, A Rainstorm's Coming, The Man with the Compound Eyes 1. So this begins the actual narrative of the man with the compound eyes. Now, this section introduces us to Detlef again, after the first chapter, as well as to Sarah, who is his girlfriend. But more than that, she's a marine ecologist, biologist. She is someone who is a researcher, an activist, really fascinating figure, though I would say father's a really fascinating figure as well. So there's a lot of discussion on ecological damage, all right, because he, for instance, is someone who's an engineer who's trained in boring holes through nature, and her job is to fix the problems that humans have left on nature. So it's a lot of commentary on all those things. There's also an interesting discussion on what scientists are supposed to do. So to read out that bit, lots of people say that feelings aren't part of the scientific enterprise, but actually all scientists can do as scientists is to try to determine what's true and what isn't. So the idea that there needs to be a distinction between science and feeling, and that it has to be some kind of very clinical kind of exercise is really problematic, because truly science emerges from a desire to change lives, in which case how can you claim clinical objectivity in something like this? Even to go back to say Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, where he talks about the idea that scientists should write in the language of poetry because that bridges those gaps between a humanitarian concern and a scientific concern, which is why it actually ties up with what Sarah says. She's like, I'm a poet and a scientist. Why can't I be both? Like, so mean. Why must I be limited this way? Why can't I have feelings? You know? And it this section actually calls into question a lot of ideas about how we approach nature. So we have up till this point of time been getting the perspective of people who live alongside nature, or people who've come to occasionally listen to nature, mostly ignore nature, that kind of an equation. So what about people who actively attempt or work towards changing nature, right? Like for instance, for Detlef, building that tunnel is kind of this, can we do it, as humans, can we achieve this? It's more about the challenge of it. It's not about actually understanding the dangers of how that could impact nature. But that experience is a frightening experience for him, because we're already told about what happened in the cave. Hearing that sound really frightened him, frightened everybody involved, because they hurt the heart of the mountain and it was not pleasant. So there's a series of sections where it comes up where it's transformed his approach to nature. So he says in page 237, we thought we were making a scientific judgment, but actually we were making a lifestyle choice. It's a question of what you really want. What kind of a life do you want to live? Or, even for instance, later on he talks about what kind of an island do you want? It's not about whether you should be doing this or not. It's about do you require this? Is this necessary to your existence? And I think this actually comes up in part 9, in page 270. I'm afraid the main issue right now is the necessity of the project, not the technical challenge. It's about what kind of island do you want? What kind of a space do you really want to live in? All right, and these are not easy questions for a person to ask, because just around the time when he hears noise, there is a segment where he says, quite unprofessionally, he even wondered whether he was damaging something or about to disturb something, but this feeling was fleeting. Detlef was the technical person, and the training he had received was not to feel moral doubt or indulge his imagination, but to assess the current situation and recommend the most advantageous and quickest possible resolution. All right, because the point is not to break your head about how and is it correct, is it ethical, which is a problem, because ideally if you're engaging with nature, your first question should be whether it's an ethical choice or not. Anywho, there hadn't been another cave-in, but that didn't make any difference to any of them, because there had been such a strange oppressive air, such a distinctly hostile atmosphere in the cave. Just now everyone had felt it. Alright, now this is a really, really interesting statement, because we realize that there's something malicious about that energy that they experience, right? And this comes up a few times. I'm going to skip ahead to a few chapters and of course come back again in order later. So for instance, when Alice and Atlee go through the experience with the bear on the mountain, they too experience the power of nature, and it's very interestingly described. But Alice and Atlee both seem to have died and come back to life. They had scented something ancient, like the mountain itself, but somehow not quite the same. Something divine. If it had wanted to, it could have taken their lives away. That's the kind of power that nature around us actually possesses. So most of the time, we're living on mercy. All right. Similarly, when Detlef and Sarah, they go into the forest church and they experience, the idea of being in the cave itself and experiencing another kind of heart of the mountain. It's a very beautiful spiritual experience for Detlef. So, not surprisingly, this is in page 311. Not surprisingly, the sound that a living forest or mountain makes is different from the sound of an eviscerated mountain. So, the idea that you have experienced the of death of an entire space, obviously that's going to be a very, very different kind of experience from the life, the budding, energetic life of a space. Now, in page 250 and 251, we are introduced to forage culture. We are introduced to the kind of cuisine that's at the heart of Panga people. All right. And it's really important because every culture has had a tradition of foraging for food, because food shortages or even not having access to enough food has been a reality for many cultures. Even for instance, in the section in the memoir record by Ji Hyuna, where she talks about the Artist March, the North Korean experience of the famine. And she talks about foraging for food over there. It's coming out of necessity, right? And the thing is that multiple cultures, many ancient cultures, have engaged with that, and it becomes this essential part of their cuisine. So both these sections talk about the kind of food they eat, the kind of wild ingredients, and it's called wild ingredients, which both makes sense, and it's also so problematic to be calling that, but yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And culturally as well, there's a tendency to look at foraged food socially, there's a tendency to look at foraged food as somehow backward, but that's not correct. It's actually a reflection of how communities and cultures have survived despite everything. All right, so those two sections are really interesting, and foraging is very essential to survival. Understanding of how food is produced and how to be able to access food from around you and to recognize what can be eaten, what cannot be eaten, those are very important skills. Now, part 9, the chapters are the coastal highway, the mountain path, the man with the compound eyes 2. So here, some of the arguments we actually have already covered because we kind of jumped ahead. But we're also introduced to Roald Amundsen, that is Sarah's father, and he's a very fascinating figure. So this is an interesting piece of colonial history that he brings up when he says that he'd heard that fishermen in search of cod had discovered the New World earlier than Columbus, but had kept it a secret in order to guard their fishing ground. Makes so much sense. All right. And he discusses his idea of whaling. Now, obviously, hunting, a lot of people have very strong opinions about it. Some say it's perfectly fine, some say it's not okay. But he discusses his idea of hunting, and he gives a really interesting statement of it. So that comes up in page 272 and 273, where he says that hunting is important, provided you hunt one whale in a year, provided you make it enough of a challenge for the whale as well, that there's every possibility you could survive or the whale could survive, and he talks about how people complain about using the harpoon as it being somehow more violent, and he's like, all life must feel pain in the face of death. To live without pain is to live without dignity. We venerate the whales and don't intend to kill them off, and I don't make them suffer on purpose. We put our lives on the line in exchange for theirs. When I hunt a whale, it's either him or me. I don't condone the commercial hunt any more than you. It's the commercial hunters who are driving the whales to extinction. You should be going after them, not us. Get it? And he goes on to also say, people are a link in the food chain, and hunting in moderation won't cause any species to disappear. Hunting whales made the old Scandinavian fishermen strong. This you must understand, my little Sarah. So he's actually even teaching his daughter about it. But soon after that, and you can see how strongly he feels about it, because he keeps poking himself with those fish hooks, which he says is to feel what the fish feel. But soon after that, there's that whole experience where he goes seal hunting, which he later calls seal murder, and it's a really gruesome, disturbing section to read. All right, and yeah, let me just read it. Page 278. People weren't just killing seals for survival anymore, and more importantly, the hunters clearly had the energy and the ability to check whether the seals were still suffering, but their hearts remained unmoved. It must have taken them long years of training to turn their hearts to stone. Men who had to hunt for food did not have hearts of stone. They were full of gratitude towards the hunted animal, just as the eyes of their women folk and children waiting eagerly at home were full of anticipation. Because it's your life, their life. It's that kind of an equation. It's kind of like you are giving something, taking something. It's that kind of a thing. So there is no blatant murder of it. So it, in that sense, what he's saying is that hunting for sport, hunting because you want something from their bodies, those things are problematic. Hunting for food, and to be very conscious of how you go about it, is a very different thing, and that may not necessarily be as terrible as it is presented. So it challenges a lot of viewpoints. Now, interestingly, in page 279, we're again introduced to the compound eyes, but very differently so. Amundsen's eyes were flashing like he had an insect's compound eyes. He is someone who has so become attuned to nature that he's practically the man with the compound eyes. That's a very interesting thing that comes up over here. All right, because it challenges a lot of interesting perspectives here, because the assumption is that shouldn't it be for someone from specific communities, from specific spaces, but it's very interesting that Ming doesn't do that. It's just about somebody who has come to understand nature so closely that maybe they might inhabit that space as well. They might become so attuned to nature. It's a very interesting thing. There is, of course, also a lot of discussion on the Aboriginal communities in Taiwan and how their names, basically, Panga means people, Bunun mean true people, all of those things. So the idea of identity and land being tied together is something that also comes up over here. All right. And we, of course, know that this is a section where Alice goes on her journey up the mountain because she wants closure, which is actually such a healthy thing because she's taking that step forward. So now part 10. All right. Part 10, the chapters are the forest cave, the cave beneath, the man with the compound eyes 3. So a few of the things we have again already covered. So let's move to Sarah's father, who's clearly murdered, and we're told a bit about how he was quite the activist and made things really hard for people in power who must have just found him such a nuisance and thus may have asked for him to be eliminated. So his murder is possibly one of the most graphic incidents that we have, besides the murder of the seals itself. So it's a really distressing incident, and it comes to us very matter-of-factly because the idea is that these things happen. You challenge authority, you challenge power, you challenge economic power especially. They are bound to do something to remedy that situation for themselves. All right. And again, we're introduced to the man with the compound eyes, but now we're given detail on how his eyes really look. So this comes up in page 322. And the scene in each of the tiny omatidia that compose every compound eye is completely different with each passing instant. Watching carefully, the man's mind is helplessly mesmerized by the instantaneous images playing in each omatidium. Could be an erupting undersea volcano, might be a falcon's eye view of a landscape, perhaps just a leaf about to fall. Each seemed to be playing a kind of documentary. So he has insect eyes, those small. And with each, he observes and records nature. And his job is to basically do that. It's not a profession, it's a calling. His calling is to not intervene but to record. And this is where he discusses memories, and he discusses the truth about Toto. And this might come as quite the shock for whoever started the story, that Toto died much earlier, and it's purely Alice's memories that have kept him alive. And this kind of like a folie du, both of them in the shared delusion have kept their son alive through their memories and through their statements. But he died much earlier, and that's such a distressing realization, because you realize that she should have had a chance at closure a lot earlier, but finally it comes to her now, with all these dramatic things happening around her as well. It's quite distressing. And he does discuss memory in detail, but more than anything else, we kind of see that it's such a heartbreaking realization of grief. But ultimately, even for Alice, it is a journey into nature that gives her a chance to come to terms with her grief, because she wants to observe and see the land and understand, okay, this is where it happened, this is how I lost my child, or this is where my husband went, and to sort of then come to terms with what she has finally experienced, to be able to put into words what she's gone through. Part 11 has just 2 chapters, The Man with Compound Eyes 4 and End of the Road. Toto has heard what the Man with Compound Eyes said about how he's actually already dead, and he finds release because he's also been trapped by his mother's memories. He's been trapped in the land, in the space, by those memories. So he's being released just as he releases all those beetles as well. Alright? Because actually, understanding nature should tell us something about grief itself, because no one understands grief better than nature. There's always something dying and living constantly in nature. So it truly understands the fact that these things are inevitable. And maybe us coming to terms with that is so essential. There is, of course, an undertone of nature and politics constantly going on, because you cannot discuss a text on nature without discussing the political problems that caused it and restrict us from truly acting on it. Alright, so in page 340 there's a segment which actually is interesting, because they're talking about there's a deluge of reports of floods and landslides along with the concomitant economic downturn. The malaise had lasted over a year and had contributed to the low voter turnout, less than 50%, in the election at the end of the previous year. The islanders no longer believed any politician could get them out of this mess. It's kind of like Jose Saramago seeing the whole idea of seeing what's happening to nature gives us a sense that people are saying something, or the politicians are promising something, but it's not showing up in reality. It's them understanding the world. We also get a hint as to what happens to Drusilla. We also start to understand and so which is why when Atlee goes on his journey, it's kind of sad, because you already know what's happened to Drusilla. There's no guarantee whether he's going to actually meet his child. So many things. It's a very complicated sense, but maybe some people are fated to make that journey anyway. So it's a really it's a very bittersweet kind of record. We see how nature reclaims spaces. For instance, they talk about a road that was built purely to transport nuclear waste, and finally, and it was a road that should have never come up, a very unnecessary kind of road, and how nature finally reclaims it. Similarly, tying up with what the Earth Sage said, that sometimes somebody else's actions can cause Vayu to disappear, we also see about how Vayu actually gets destroyed, and and as a result of it, the second sons, who transform into sperm whales, kill themselves off a coast. And it's a very distressing thing, because none of the humans there can understand what is happening to these whales, but we understand through the despair of their homeland being sort of destroyed. So it's a lot of heartbreaking things, but at the same time there's a sense that, we have to learn to survive, we have to learn to sort of move on. But what kind of ending that does that leave us with is something worth debating. All right, so with this, we'll wrap up with our discussion of the chapters. We will come back to a conclusion of the entire novel. Thank you.